Give me a second to set up my camera. Okay. Okay. Am I visible?
Yep, you were good.
Speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that the decentralized financial systems will look like that the central bank, or the traditional way of financing, has less influence like towards financial entities, right? I.e., private banks or regional banks, or even like to this extent of, like, for example, fintech that we have, PayPal, etc., right? So this looks like if the central bank increases their interest rate, smaller private banks or independent regional banks won't have the obligation to follow the interest rate. They have an independent decision-making process. This looks like they have even more freedom to within their own system, right? Though to a certain extent, maybe central bank has control over the amount of, like, for example, tax interest or security measures, making sure that banks can give back money to the people, or for not for banks or financial entities to not make risky behaviors. Though it goes to that extent, it would be very minimum. It means that these financial entities such as banks or fintech have their own freedom towards what they're going to do with their finances, right? So how will the support of the advent of a decentralized financial systems look like, right? This looks like we're supporting more government to opt into this decentralized financial system. This looks like pushing more companies to and more countries to opt into this. This looks like more developed countries opting into this, and other countries can model what these developed countries are doing. We think that this push is important. So when government is hesitant towards like implementing these things, we need to push on the idea that on how this can benefit the economy in general, right? So two arguments I'll bring into this debate, right? First, why relying on one centralized entity is bad, but second, on why decentralization can resolve in better economic situation in general, right? So first, on why relying on one centralized entity. For example, in traditional transactions, this looks like relying on a central bank. It means that the stability really relies on this whole entity, right? This means if there's a turbulence in the system, they're facing a problems, other banks are going to be influenced, right? This looks like, for example, central banks are responsible for like bailing out banks that are in the brink of bankruptcy. This looks like, if this is something that happens, this creates a domino effect towards the other banks that will also be affected. So since every single bank is dependent towards this one central bank, right? We think when this happens, this is when it creates two harms. We think that one, the society can have distrust towards either be it the government or the whole financial system, because liquidity are being transferred everywhere, and it doesn't seem like it's getting to be stable anytime soon, because again, it's going to be transferred from one place to another. For example, the money from the liquidity from one bank is going to be transferred to bail out another bank, etc. Right? We think that this is when the liquidity of these regional banks are already small and limited already. This being transferred everywhere creates a very unstable situation. But second, we think that when interest rates are very dependent towards central bank, this is when competitive rates cannot exist, right? This means that there's really no difference putting your money in like several different banks, because then at the end it's like putting your money at just one centralized entity, right? But when this happens, interest rate is very important when it is competitive. This means that it's giving people choices, right? It's not only regarding interest rate, but it's also regarding, for example, when it's decentralized, you actually have more freedom in your system or in the rule making or your financial regulation. Yes, to a certain extent, it is controlled by the government, but you have even more freedom when you're not dependent towards this one entity, right? This means that when people have more freedom, this is when people are most likely able like to opt in and to create more liquidity, which I will later explain. But second, on how this one centralized entity create an economic bubble, we think that this is the same problem with the housing problem, right? In which like people are taking out mortgage to like buy houses, and once the bubble bursts, since everyone is doing it, no one end up buying their house, etc., right? This looks like the interconnection that the centralized system creates. Once the bubble bursts, it's going to take a lot to recover, right? If people are, going to, take out so many loans, etc., right? But thirdly, we think when it comes to like this implementation of decentralized financial banks, we think that there will be a high likelihood in which government is going to educate the society, right? When they want to implement a policy, they would want to like the people to opt in anyway. So negative cannot come to this debate by saying that it's too complicated, etc. We think that it's going to be socialized to the people, especially to the financial entities that's operating in a certain country. Second argument then on why the decentralized financial system is going to be better. I think that one, it will look like this they will be able to run independently and check and balance each other, right? This looks like there will be a competitive race between banks or between fintech. People have more options to choose from since there is this competitive race. This looks like people wanting to even like better opt in into lending money or borrowing money. This creates a whole a productive system within the society, since they can check and balance each other. It doesn't mean that it means that they have control over their finances, and they have control over the system that they want to implement towards their users, for example, right? Or towards their people that actually use their services. But second, we think that it will be much more stable, since each financial entity again has control over their finances, right? It means that they have even more control in controlling their interest rate, on choosing which one is more strategic for their business or for their service to continuously run. I think this is important, right? Because when we're talking about economy or talking about financial entity, we cannot simply rely that, oh yeah, this looks good at first glance, but we need to think about the sustainability over it, right? But then when it comes to centralized bank, these financial entities don't really have that much freedom when it's centralized, right? We think that when it's decentralized and they have more freedom, this is when they can choose the strategy that they actually want to use to actually able to profit themselves, or to keep themselves running, or to keep themselves afloat in the middle of like the competition. We think this is much better, right? Rather than having like a very slow competition under the negative side of the house, because then your actions are very much limited by the regulations that you should follow, right? But thirdly, we think that this opens up more opportunities for the economy to grow, right? One, we think that this brings more liquidity and economic benefits towards the people. It's easier for people like to lend money or to borrow money from this one application, for example, or from this one bank. It is easier for them to do so, since people are able then to strategize on how they're going to use their money. But secondly, this gives more freedom towards this financial institution, to then create, for example, better security. Sure, there is security measure from the government, but they can do a step further, right? Since they have this slight freedom, or like even like a marginal freedom that they can get for being centralized. But when this happens, this is when you can people can ensure, for example, better security, but also they're able to get liquidity and more accessible, more accessible banks to go to, or more accessible applications that they can take money from. We think that when this is what creates a good economy, right? When people are able to access things, but the security is also something that's manage something that's also promised and guaranteed. But at the same time, you have competitive financial entities that check and balances each other. We think when this happens, the advent of decentralized financial systems should be supported, developing.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the first negative speaker to begin next case.
Hello, just checking that I'm audible.
Yep, we're good.
Cool. Look, by the nature of this motion, it's never going to be good enough for affirmative to stand by slightly freer markets for banks. They have to stand by what what decentralized financial system actually looks like in practice, which looks like the speculative markets of cryptocurrency and the FX crash that have robbed significant people of their livelihoods. But even if it is the case that they are able to just stand by slightly more deregulated banks, it's really bad to do that because we have quite limited regulations on banks at the moment, and the ones we have are designed to promote confidence in the financial system. I'm going to talk to you first about why. I'm just going to deal with some context at first, then I'm going to explain to you why reducing financial regulation reduces stability in the markets, which leads to people not having confidence in their ability to spend their money. And third, how this increases the amount of fraud that exists and why that's really harmful. No, look, in terms of context, maybe it's the case that you buy through the advent of cryptocurrency, and anything that isn't cryptocurrency, we tell you is likely going to be relatively similar. Why is that the case? We tell you that the current centralized financial system has massive buy-in from most people, right? Which means that there's a relatively high cost to starting up an alternative or to engaging in a decentralized financial system because you need to convince people to use it and you have to compete against this pre-existing major market. We also tell you that there's relatively high risks of loss because no one's going to trust a financial system that collapses once. As such, the people engaging in this decentralized financial system are likely going to be people who are likely going to be relatively high degrees of deregulation. It's likely going to look like cryptocurrency. But let's deal with the best case here, because they try to tell you, oh, we can stand by like competitive rates, we can stand by decreasing interest rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just note what the state of regulation of markets is right now. We tell you that there's been massive neoliberal market pressure for the last like 4 decades. We tell you this looks like Rogenomics and the equivalent in the West, but we also tell you it looks like things being enforced by the WTO, by the World Bank, and the IMF as conditions of lending to these nations that mean that the existence of regulations on these firms is relatively limited and is because note these are firms that are ideologically opposed to the forms of market interventionism. And we tell you the types of regulations that exist are typically quite limited and look like things like minimum cash on hand so that you're able to prevent a collapse of a market if there's a run on the bank. We tell you it looks like reporting where money is so that people can be confident that when they go to the bank, they're actually going to get enough money. We tell you it looks like having oversight so you don't set interest rates so high that you're not going to be able to pay people and ensure that your bank isn't going to run out of money. In short, they're all of the types of things that are needed to give people confidence in the fact that the financial system isn't going to collapse, right? Structurally, those are the types of regulations that are likely to survive, and they need to stand up to you and explain why those are so particularly quite harmful. Just dealing with extraneous rebuttal of the court in 8 was unconstrained corporate profit seeking. That meant that they tried to charge far too high prices due to under-regulation, which led to at the point where people stopped being able to pay firmly. Impossible when you have a centralized financial system where you have to engage with central banks and other regulators. As such, if you care about the types of examples they gave you, you probably don't want to decentralize the financial system. At the end of this, you believe this is probably a debate where they have to stand by the rise of cryptocurrency. Even if they don't, the types of regulations they're talking about are removing are really dangerous and they shouldn't do that. Okay, why has the advent been bad? Look, just the concept. So first, on instability of financial systems. Look, the context for this is, right, it's just that state backing of financial systems has led to massive stability, right? Like we no longer have the South Seas bubble crashing the pound sterling every couple of years because we've got a central bank that stops them doing that. We don't have to rely on a gold standard because we actually have centralized banks that everyone trusts to keep the money at a reasonable supply. It means that the value is likely to be relatively stable. By contrast, systems like theirs, you do not have this stability because inherently you don't have this stability because inherently these firms have done away with the most important stability providing regulation. But second, we tell you in the case of cryptocurrencies and things like that, the value is entirely set by demand and market speculation. As such, it fluctuates massively. This is particularly true in the context of the hype around these decentralized financial systems that you've heard about recently. And as such, the value is likely to swing. This means that decentralized financial systems are inherently less stable than these money out at the end of the day. That's why we put up with these systems. What do we tell you the context is? First, Affirmative has to stand by the fact people have lost a lot of money in this. We tell you that these are really complicated systems that are relatively hard for people to understand, which means that people often get into them, at least as casual people, at the wrong times. We tell you this looks like getting into cryptocurrency right on the upward swing and losing a coin, and then lost a bunch of money when Elon Musk were involved. No, these are not possible in any sort of financial centralized system, because the centralized system has regulations on the way you're decentralizing these financial systems opens them up massively to market manipulation. First, in terms of cryptocurrency, we tell you this looks like things like Dogecoin. We tell you it looks like things like buying up massive amounts to drive up the price and then selling yours before everyone else does. But we tell you in their best case, this also just looks like banks offering way too high interest rates to get people to do term deposits and then just running out of money and collapsing, meaning people lose a ton of money, right? People wouldn't be able to deal with that. But third, we also tell you that when you do away with these regulations, you can just lose all of their money totally because of things like, for example, in the case of cryptocurrency, FX going down because it's a relatively new decentralized financial system that doesn't have the stability and regulation needed to make sure that people have trust in it. But also, in the case of the decentralized banks, people are likely going to these banks, because they're likely, under their own case, likely to be taking more risky behavior, taking more aggressive activity. They're more likely to run out of money, go broke. This means that firms are likely to lose lots of money. At the end of this, then, you're convinced that decentralized financial systems are inherently less stable in a way that means that people lose lots of money. All of the, I shouldn't need to explain to you exactly how harmful this is, because at the point you've put lots of significant, or in their case, potentially entire businesses into a decentralized system, that's really harmful. In terms of fraud and crime, there's a reason we have a centralized financial system on a global scale, right? Like, it's because when you've got centralized banks, you can have cross-border schemes to regulate financial systems to ensure that money isn't going into crime. You're able to track where money is going and stop the flow of crime, prevent things like money laundering. We tell you that by contrast, this is multinational, decentralized systems are likely going to lack this network, but are also likely to be relatively digital. And third, are relatively new trends. This means that they're much less secure, they're much less regulated, they're much less, again, likely to comply with that money laundering legislation. At a first level, we tell you this massively increases the amount of crime that is able to occur because organized crime is able to smuggle it. We tell you this also leads to incidental increases in things like terrorism, because a lot of the regulations that they want to deal with are likely often ones involved in also stopping the flow of money to organized crimes. But further, we also tell you it means that things like fraudulent schemes are likely to last much longer. Why is that the case? Because at the point that those reporting requirements and things like that go down, and you don't have the centralized system which is able to detect these schemes, you're likely going to not be able to a decentralized system will either not be incentivized to, because it's much less regulated, or is going to be much less able to detect it, which means you have less ability to detect fraud. On the whole, then, what you get when you decentralize the financial system is you get a massive loss of faith in the ability of banks to protect people's money, and you also reduce the insurance that the money doesn't go to crime. That's really harmful. We should not support this.
I think first negative for that speech and welcome second affirmative to continue Af's case.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think negative can't win this debate by basing their whole case on cryptocurrency, because what they will have to define is a centralized financial system, right? If you regret the decentralized financial systems. The reason why cryptocurrency is not valid, because it's not exactly the definition of decentralized system, since they are blocking chain, for example. So it's more of like a blockchain technology that transform the whole financial system. What it means to be decentralized is that we don't really change the whole components. For example, that's why we characterize that usual banks would still access, central banks access, private banks, and also smaller regional banks will access. But it's just that we don't want it to be centralized. That means commands doesn't only come from one central bank, which is led by one financial minister. I'd also like to point out that they never really engaged to the ideas of spiderweb interconnectivity that makes the economy vulnerable, that the central bank controlling everything to the point that bank liquidity are all focused on there. Therefore, they're not quite engaging. But okay, if they want to talk about cryptocurrency, let's engage with that idea, right? Let's say that cryptocurrency is some form of a decentralized economy. We don't think they can base their whole case on cryptocurrency because there would still be other check and balance. For example, crypto is just one example of a fintech, right? Financial technology. But there are also other examples, for example, like PayPal or corporates making online payments like Amazon Pay. So we do agree to some extent that fintech will thrive, but it's unfair for you to say that all of it is bad just because of a one single examples. But okay, engaging to the damage that probably cryptocurrency created, we will tell you that it's not because of the decentralization per se, but because people are not educated enough. For example, maybe because people treat cryptocurrency not as currency but as investment. While we want as I characterized before, that when are going to make central banks lose some sort of its power to influence other banks, there would still be education to people, right? Therefore, the problem is not on decentralized banks. We do think that we want people to have many options. So yeah, engaging to the worst case scenario where crypto was booming and that's what give people confidence. But then but now crypto is that. But that just shows that organic decline happens on either side of the house, and therefore you should let economy to fix itself. For example, the delta on our side of the house is that if there is decline in stock market, for example, that's it, and it affects all the other economy in the country, right? Because everything is dependent in one centralized system. On our side, yeah, we bite the bullet that cryptocurrency is that, but there are still other ways for people to trade and opt into savings. The check and balance argument stands since my first affirmative. Therefore, I do believe that they can't run on that case. A second rebuttal is that when they say that regulation is already so minimum right now, therefore when you give even more freedom to these other banks, they're going to do risky behaviors or risky investments. First, I think it's fair to assume that country wouldn't let banks just do whatever the hell they want. So regulations will be enough. For example, if banks are not able to return the money that their citizens have put in that bank, they're going to they're going to face consequences. For example, this looks like that your ability to open up the bank is going to be like taken away, right? The permit to run the business. And I do think that the freedom that we mean is that they cannot strawman it as if it's absolute freedom, because we tell you that what we mean by central bank having less power or influence is on things like we don't want all banks to have the same interest. Like, for example, if central banks raise the interest, since all the smaller or private banks are going to borrow money from the central bank, that means they're also going to increase their interest. And the same way, they're also going to decrease their interest and the same flow. So this is why we do think that regulations in terms of security is possible in our side of the house. But what we don't want is regulations to the point that it makes all banks are essentially the same, which is one central bank, because you control it to that point. And it's something that they will have to defend. Last rebuttal, right? That people lose confidence in the market. I don't think this is the case, because confidence relies on people being sure that their money is going to come back to them and profit. The reason that it won't happen on our side of the house is because in terms of their examples, they rely this logic on examples of cryptocurrency, right? So in terms of that's already not really that convincing. But on to the logic itself, I don't think that decentralization makes people lose confidence, because instead it actually allows people to have more choices in their decision making. It allows people to have more assurance that their economy is not fragile, because although things like bubbles can happen on both sides of the house, we tell you that our sides will be the buffer that let the damage of economic downturn to at least be minimum. And I'll talk about that in my extension. So what's the problem with centralized financial system really is that everything is interconnected, right? It might be intuitive to think that, if they're all working under one central bank, it's more stable. But that's not how it works. When economic bubble bursts, sure, like it causes both damage. But on a centralized economy, no institution acts as a buffer. That's because when people pay mortgages, for example, they want to take mortgages, they want to borrow money from the banks. Essentially, it's they are borrowing money from the same one bank, which is they're borrowing money from the same source of liquidity. Exactly why what we mean by decentralized is that we want liquidity to be like sparse, right? To be spread it on all banks. Therefore, no one acts as a buffer, because when this kind of bubble bursts, what you will have is that people having mortgages that they cannot pay, and it will affect this one central bank, and that's why your economy is going to be on shambles. Comparatively on decentralized economy, we do think that it's much better, because for example, when this kind of thing happen, then the people who cannot pay that mortgages will probably affect one type of cash flow, but it doesn't affect all types of cash flow that the countries have, right? Therefore, on centralized economy, it's more like sensitive to changes in it, and therefore more vulnerable. Why is it good then on our side of the house? We think it's good on microeconomy, because on negative side, you have multiple banks, but they're actually just a single bank, right? Therefore, when people put their money on, let's say, 5 banks, I diversify my portfolio, they're still putting it in one bank, and that's why people are so vulnerable to economic downturn. On affirmative, when people put their money on 5 different banks, that means they're putting their money on 5 branches of the economy, and therefore it's safer because you have multiple investments happening, and it's banks can run independently and check and balance each other. The whole idea of competitiveness that my previous speaker have said before, right? We do think that centralization, when you have banks that are not working well, let's say I engage to the worst case scenario, maybe this bank was bankrupt because of mismanagement, maybe they take too much risk. In these cases, the central bank will have to cover for that, right? On both sides of the house, central bank will probably have to bail it out. But the delta is, on our side of the house, since central bank is not connected to other banks, the bankruptcy or the failure of one bank will not affect the whole economy. On your side of the house, if one bank is on the default, that affect the whole trust of the country. Exactly why people will have less trust, because when one thing goes wrong, they generalize it to the whole economy, and it's probably right because it's centralized. Most likely, you will see that kind of changes being manifested. That's why we're proud to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative for that speech and welcome second negative to continue the neg team's case.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep, you can be heard.
Sorry, I just get confirmation that you guys can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, note that after 2 speeches, have we not heard a single example of a widespread economic collapse because a central bank system collapsed? For example, in our speeches, Harry gave you many examples of when decentralized banks make very risky decisions that don't consider the same things that a central bank has to consider. That means that there is collapse, but not that their exact reasons why the central bank system will have to step in and bail out these companies means that we win the debate there. It proves that the central bank system is more likely to protect people in a way that matters. 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to examine the incentives of decentralized banks and why they're uniquely bad actors, which proves that none of their material stands in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to explain the incentives of centralized banks in comparison and why they are far, far better at making the economy work. And then finally, I'm going to explain how crypto extends the margin of victory in this debate. Firstly, then, what incentives do centralized banks have? 1, profit. This is something that they need to stand by, right? And that the main reason why these decentralized banks exist is that every single decision they make, every single micro policy that they make for themselves to operate by is driven by extending the margin of profit that they can make out of people that put their money in the system. What does this mean? 1, they are willing to make sacrifices at the expense of mum and dad who have their mortgage in that bank. But secondly, they're very happy to make decisions that are very independent from the system. This means if they see a loophole in regulation, they'll jump through it, or they'll literally pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to lobby sympathetic people and governments to avoid this regulation. Secondly, then, because they have this incentive of profit, that means that they will avoid literally any kind of restriction that you try and put on them. Just like I told you that they're going to spend lots of money on lobbying against it, by the global financial crisis, which I know it was like literally caused by them making their policy riskier and riskier and riskier to the point where you literally just had everything go bust. They will make loopholes to try and jump out of the regulation that governments put on them, because of the way that these decentralized banks can evolve faster than regulation can. That means that they have to stand by the fact that these companies will take risks, that these risks and that these people will have definitive consequences. What does this mean then? Firstly, this flips the material about there's going to be checks and balances in the system. Never was it explained why these decentralized banks would have any incentive to control each other, right? Because their goal is kind of like common in that they all want to make profit, which means that instead of like, pointing the finger and showing a government where a bank has been evil, what they're going to do is turn a blind eye so they can conveniently do the same thing, and they're going to continue to make riskier policies. What this means then is if one bank makes a really risky policy, the incentive isn't for every other bank to try and counteract that risk. The incentive of every other bank is to make that same policy so that they continue to increase the amount of money that they can make. So that point doesn't exist anymore. Secondly, all of this analysis of the incentives of decentralized banks also flips their material about the interest rate control, because they said that like somehow these banks are going to be really good at making decisions about setting interest rates and setting a different like goalposts for them to be existing properly in the economy. But what incentive do they have to like control it in a way that actually benefits anyone, right? As long as it benefits their bottom dollar, they need to explain why their bottom dollar is going to align with the incentives of everyday people. Economy grows, because what actually happens is that while the economy might grow, but it comes at the expense of no one ever being able to buy a house. It comes at the expense of no one being able to afford anything, because the money is growing in a way that benefits people who have the most amount of money in the bank, rather than people who are just trying to get by. But even if you don't believe any of that material, just think about it, right? How many times can you imagine a decentralized bank has collapsed? Many banks have collapsed many times over to the point when they need to be bought out or bailed out by the government. In comparison, centralized banks have not done this at any rate that is comparable, which means if you're weighing just on this issue alone, the debate has to fall to us, because it's more likely that a decentralized bank will collapse than a centralized bank. That's quite clear. Okay. Let's compare this to what the incentives of central banks are. Firstly, because they are literally answerable to the public, right? Because this is an important part. If they are connected to the government, the people have a direct way that they can that they can force their elected officials, or even if it's not an democracy, these people can still place pressure on the government with their wallets, or the way that they buy things, or the way that they, go out and protest, so that the government is pushed to make decisions that grow the economy. But even if the government isn't answerable to their people and doesn't want to do it exactly in the way that the people want, right, they still have an incentive to grow the economy, because what makes their people richer also makes them as a country richer. Secondly, though, when you have a centralized bank, they are definitely going to be regulated, and they're definitely going to be regulated in a way that protects people. Firstly, for that same mechanism that I gave you earlier about why it grows the economy, and that they're accountable to people. So when people see mum and dad get robbed of their money, they see vulnerable people lose out, they place pressure on their government to make regulation that protects those people. But secondly, even if the government doesn't make regulations to try and protect these people, the government still has an incentive to protect these people, because it saves them money in the long term, right? They don't have to do bailouts in the long term. They don't have to, try and give benefits to other people, because they have people being independent with their money, and they're able to stand on their own 2 feet. But thirdly, for all of the reasons that Harry gave you about why it's better when you have money or any asset tied to a country as security, why that means that it's always going to be less likely that you collapse, because in order for the centralized decentralized bank to collapse, the entire country has to collapse. We accept that in some cases, it is because of external political factors. That is because the country has failed in other ways, and not because of in fact, that the bank or in the financial system is centralized in the first place. Okay, finally, let's look at why cryptocurrency is still in this debate and why it's basically just an extension and a next stage of decentralization. All that Harry told you was that the goal of decentralization is to move in, is for these decentralized banks to take that next leap of faith, get away from the US dollar and try and create their own currency so that they are ultimately devoid of any chance of being regulated. This means that because I've explained what their incentives are, the cryptocurrency is still a factor in this debate, and that means that their only response being that the reason that cryptocurrency is bad is because people are uneducated. But the fact that cryptocurrency is bad is not just because it's people are uneducated, it's because it's unregulated. So that means that all of the analysis that I just gave you about incentives applies to all of the analysis that Harry gave as a way that we extend the margin of victory, because people are harmed by decentralized banks, but they're harmed even worse by cryptocurrency. We win this debate quite clearly.
I'd like to thank the second negative speaker for that speech and welcome third affirmative to close the substantive portion of the affirmative team's case.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, give me a moment. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two clashes in my speech. First of all, how does the economy look like on either side of the house? And second of all, the options of other decentralized financial system, because decentralized means there's going to be other competitors out there. These are the two clashes. Everything will be engaged within these clashes, right? First clash, two things that negative team tells you. First of all, they tell you economic downturn does not happen because a central bank is super strong and super stable and everything, right? Two responses. First of all, this isn't exclusive. Central banks exist on both sides of the house. What is the difference on our side is that the government bank on our side, just exists, but the other decentralized financial system is able to compete with it. On your side, you have to be able to really characterize why a single entity holding all of the financial systems of a country of all the world is actually going to be strong enough. My first affirmative has already told you that, and that has never been engaged. If this new substantive comes out at negative whip, it's going to be new material that should not be credited. That is why all of the benefits of like a strong government bank still exist on both sides of the house. That's not something you can buy into negative, right? Second response, we never said economic collapse happens because of a centralized economy. We tell you that the economy collapse because a centralized financial system will be more vulnerable because it trickles down, and there's this spider web where if the main bank, the central financial system is affected, it's going to trickle down to all of the other smaller or medium systems that relies on this centralized one, right? Because when there is a problem, the first thing a country do is to increase interest rate, but instead it just makes it actually just decreases people's trust. Well, the solution is that it shouldn't be a centralized problem solving. It's not only about interest, but and it shouldn't be the only tool. That's why other things like strengthening currency, increasing confidence and awareness by the citizens is actually responses with my previous speakers have already told you, and that should be the solution. And that's why we tell you why, even if there is a problem that comes up, it's going to be much better mitigated on our side of the house. Economic downturn has been resolved on our side, right? Second thing coming from negative, they tell you this decentralized financial system will make riskier policies because they're just gonna care about profit and they just want to do everything for the profit, right? I have 3 engagements towards this. First of all, I think we need to question first why decentralized banks will go to the extreme scenario. Let's be rational and use this debate on a benevolent scenario that they would be careful because this is money that we're talking about, and these other systems are not going to be crazy and just make it very extreme. Why? Too high of an interest, for an example, will cause loss to the bank and people will not trust into it, and take their money out, right? Or if the registration fee for this financial system is too expensive, no one wants to buy it. See, notice that that's why it's gonna be rational. That there is still a board of directors within the system that makes sure the strategy that all of these systems take will be rational, because the likelihood for this is that decentralized systems and banks are going to be rational because they want to keep their systems alive. They want to keep their banks alive. And the only way to do this is making sure that the users trust them, that the citizens trust to use it, and it can keep going. That is why they're not all of that extreme scenarios coming from negative will already fall, right? Second thing, even if there are one or two banks that are risky and taking extreme costs, where we say people will opt out of it, right? If people see that, oh, this interest is too high and it's super suspicious, I don't want to put my money there, they're not going to opt in, and it's going to be much better because that's a whole mechanism on our side, right? Multiple financial systems exist on our side that people can opt into when one is crazy. So this is how check and balance manifests on our side of the house. So second negative misunderstood there. Check and balance on our side does not manifest in a way that, oh, banks are literally checking on each other, because that doesn't make sense, right? What we're telling you, check and balance makes sense when they're independently running and they're independently competing to get the citizens to use into their systems. This is how people will be careful. If they raise the interest too much, people will not want to go there and go to a safer place. But if they're, too expensive, people also don't want to go there. This is what keeps each other in check. This is the organic check and balance that has already been manifested since my first affirmative and telling you. That is why this check and balance is exclusive on our side of the house. It does not happen then on their side because they regret this decentralized. Check and balance does not happen in a centralized financial system, because who is going to check this one huge entity as the central system when all of the other entities are actually going to be weaker and there's no check and balance there. So this is how the second clash onto the options of decentralized financial systems, because all of these other options, this has been a back and forth in this debate. What are the multiple system that looks like on our side and whether it's actually good enough for us to support it, right? Two engagements towards this. First of all, notice from the very beginning, we told you that there are multiple systems. The first engagement I give onto this clash is weighing that this debate is talking about all decentralized financial systems, not just the one thing, negative defense about crypto, right? We're not saying that we're not saying that we're not going to engage with it. I will after this, but them relying their case only on crypto is very harmful, right? Because the very first characterization, first affirmative has told you is that decentralizing means that multiple options stands. And this check and balancing is what manifests onto this, right? Because the multiple other system that are more stable stance, that's just it, right? If the problem in negative is that decentralized is unstable, and we've told you why only crypto is unstable and all of the other financial systems are more stable in a way that we are able to recharacterize decentralized financial systems are actually more stable. We tell you that their harm has already fallen. That's my first engagement. Second engagement, let's engage into their one and only option that negative gives you on cryptocurrency, right? And we're being charitable here. We tell you decentralized financial system has multiple financial system that runs in the country. So exactly, that's when the example of cryptocurrency actually fulfills our goal. When one system fails on our side, let's say cryptocurrency fail, or other examples like NFT is currently reducing in worth as well, right? People can opt out of it because there are other systems in our world that's decentralized. People are using different sources and different rates. They can invest more on the other more successful. So do not live in a vacuum. Just because cryptocurrency exists, does not mean they're gonna put all of their currency in one place in offset $100 in Bitcoin, and I lost it because Bitcoin is going down, right? That's the risk I knew when I was investing into crypto. I still have a lot of other money in the other decentralized system. I put my money in because banks still exist and I still have savings. So this is where we engage into the harms of loss of money that is glorified on negative side of the house. We tell you, yeah, it's bad if you lose money, but it doesn't mean all of your money is lost. That's the whole point of decentralized system, that you put your money in different areas and different places. So when one system fails, the other ones can still exist and our money still happens, right? That is why we support this advent of decentralized, because imagine the same scenario happening on their side of the world on a centralized system, right? If cryptocurrency was based on a centralized financial system and there's a current decline, it means that the central bank has to, put in money and continuously support the losing cost of cryptocurrency that trickles down in affecting how bank users increase, example, deposit interest so that banks get more profit. That's what exactly is so much worse on their side of the house. If there's trouble of one issue, it's going to affect of all of the others in the same central system. That's why we tell you it's harmful. That's why we take the second.
I think the third affirmative speaker for that speech, and welcome third negative to close the substantive portion of next case.
Awesome, just checking that I'm audible.
Yep.
Lovely. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Cool. 2 things to go through in this speech. Firstly, about whether this regulations and having central banks is important in stopping collapse and consumer trust and all of the flow-on impacts of losing money when you do have a collapse. And then secondly, talking about where we really extended the margin and the main push of our case about fintech and specifically crypto and why that's uniquely harmful. Note the damning engagement that was pretty much non-existent. Cool. Firstly, talking about regulations and centralization and why that's better. I think the first thing to just note is that we gave you so many incentives of why central banks are really secure at first that we never responded to, and we gave you so many things at both first and second about why private banks are purely profit motivated and why that means that they're inherently risky. Just to go over again what these incentives are and why a central bank is far less likely to collapse or go through shocks that result in people losing money. 4 things. Firstly, that you can let the smartest economic minds in your country to pay like lots and lots of money for the Reserve Bank General, to pay so much money that you're attracting the top talents in order to make sure that this is incredibly stable. I think that they have experts. I think that these experts know how to get this balance right. And I think that means that a central bank is incredibly, incredibly secure. However, even if for some reason these pens still goes wrong, then it's incredibly unlikely that even if it does go through harm, that it will actually fail. That's because, for example, increasing taxes or being able to get their allies to prop it up. Look at what happened with Greece. I think that means that even in negative side affirmatives, absolute best case scenario, these central banks never actually collapse, and therefore all of the harms never actually accrue. Third affirmative tells you that this is entirely symmetric on their side because they still have a central bank. However, we tell you it's far better for everybody to be in the same system. We tell you it's far better for everybody to be under the secure central bank as opposed to a significant proportion of people being in the unsecured decentralized bank. That's why we win. That's why it's not symmetric. Cool. What are the harms of decentralized, purely profit-motivated banks that don't have a focus on what is actually best for the broader economy and on trying to protect people's money? The first thing to note, though, is just that economic shocks can just happen out of the blue. Look at COVID, look at 2008. These were quite sudden things where economic shocks can happen. And so even if you take their analysis at its absolute best when they're just like, oh, well, these people have an incentive not for it to collapse because then they'd lose money. Sure, but that doesn't deal with the fact that economic shocks can occur suddenly. Therefore, I think it's really harmful that purely to say that corporate structure of this profit-motivated business is to incentivize the board and the executives to do things that boost the short-term profits. They are incentivized. What that means is that they're doing things which are incredibly risky. You're looking at the economic forecast and seeing that there's a projection that if interest rates were at 0 inflation, so they're going to set it at 0.3% because that's where they're able to maximize their profit without having these regulations start to fine them. However, note that it only takes a small like blow of the economic wind in the other direction for this to be a really large harm. The other thing, though, is that they are just unregulated. Note that it wasn't good enough for Third Affirmative to try and say that, oh, this regulation is the fact that they will just change their interest rates in order to be competitive. Because since they are profit motivated, I think that this check and balances doesn't happen, because once one bank decides to increase their interest rates by 0.5% to get more money, then all of the banks are going to do that, because they realize that actually consumers won't have an alternative because one has gone up, therefore everybody will. And that just means that everybody gets an increased profit, which again, these banks are fine with, because they're just looking for what is best for them and for what is best for their profits. I think that means that it's incredibly harmful, and they're putting things deeply at risk. When economic conditions slightly sour, you're able to have these highly devastating collapses. Note that all of the impacting that we had down the line is incredibly important. Yeah, because when a private bank collapses, there are sort of two scenarios. Firstly, which is the best case scenario, is that the taxpayers have to spend millions of dollars to bail it out. But I don't think after 2008, how politically unpopular that was, and how people were saying that this will never happen again, I think that the realistic alternative is that hardworking families lose all of their money, because because even though there are lots of private banks, people probably only put their money harmful, because you're losing literally your entire life savings. That is such a great harm in this debate. Central banks are always concerned with the fact that it's politically devastating if something were to go wrong. So they're playing it safe. I think that's far better than private banks, which are just focused on the short term, not focused on what have people's savings. Moving on then to where we really push the margin in this debate, which is all of the harms from about fintech, and specifically crypto, that went very under-responded to. Pretty much the only response we got is that third act, where they say that, oh, it's not a thing that engages with the reality of the case, which is sure that maybe you as an investor put in $100, but on net, millions of dollars are put in by everybody from across society. I think that is a large impact, and it's that the true reality is that because people aren't financially educated, because most people don't have an economics degree, they just trust the misleading, unregulated websites are involved in it. They want to be the people that wins big next. They want to be the people that puts in 50k hoping that they get 500k, but when they actually come out with 5k because it wasn't properly regulated, because there was a scam, or because it got hacked, then that is a huge harm to people's financial security. Again, going over all of the reasons we told you right from how to regulate this, and therefore why it's really easy for people to fall for misinformation and get scammed. That's the fact that this is a recent trend. That's the fact that it is a trend, meaning that there are lots and lots of new fintech and lots of new crypto, lots of meme crypto as well, as it becomes a trend. And the fact that you need financial education to weed through all of this means that even if they see that there are some huge things that's really hard to regulate, it's easy to fall for things, it's easy to just jump in at the peak of the trend and lose all your money, but also because it's unsecure, because of all the reasons we told you right from first year about why it's less secure, your cybersecurity protection, and it's just you as a small company. That means that you're more at risk of hacking. That means you're more at risk of being part of a cyber war between a country and its enemies, and that means that people's livelihoods, people's finances are more at risk. That is so.
I'd like to thank the third negative speaker for that speech, and welcome Neg Reply to close the negative team's case.
Okay, am I good? Good to start?
Yep.
Thanks. Look, Greece was a bit of a disaster for a centralized financial system, but do you know what and this is what we explained to you down the bench, you know what notably and know that their paycheck was going to go to a bank account or a currency that was not going to exist in 3 months. People didn't go home and find out they no longer had any money, because in a centralized system, collapse does not of any financial system is so harmful that if we that accepting any risk of collapse is quite frankly too much. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. First, which system is more stable. Second, what the economic ramifications are. And third, why the future trends in decentralization are so harmful. Okay, so why did they try and tell you a decentralized system was more stable? Look, the context of this is, panel, you're going to need quite a lot of explanation to buy into a system, buy into the fact that this is going to be more stable than a system that allowed an entire state to go into default and still not have the central bank collapse. So that is the burden they needed to meet. It was clearly placed on them throughout this entire debate. Okay, they told you, oh, but there's an economic spider web, which means a collapse in one sector brings down a collapse in all other things. No, we think this probably in their case looks like 2008, right? But let's see what actually happened after 2008. As we've explained to you down the line, because there was a centralized financial system and a centralized bank, that loss was distributed and actually people were able to recover. Yes, it was very painful. Yes, it was very harmful. But notably, no one lost everything except for the banks that were the most deregulated and the most outside of the system. This demonstrates that a centralized financial system is able to provide crucial resiliency. But then they told you, aha, but stability is provided by checks and balances, which means that these systems are going to balance each other. No response to the mechanisms that you gave, that you heard from Melissa, that took their material that came out at First Affirmative about this being a profit-seeking endeavor, that explained to you why a profit-seeking endeavor is uniquely harmful and terrible at actually providing financial stability. But second, Melissa really clearly explained to you why once one bank does this, they all follow because they all want to make the same profits, because that is the incentive that acts on them. Compare this to the direct political ramifications on a central bank. Even if you believe there is some degree of checks and balances on a individual smaller banks, there's probably much greater ones on the central bank because of the direct political ramifications. Note again, we can actually point you to the collapse of smaller banks. They never explained to you an example of a centralized system failing. Then they told you, aha, but they want to keep customers. But like, just as we've told you down the line, people don't actually know financial systems well enough to critically analyze this. And because they're all impacted by the same pressures, they're likely just going to follow on with each other so the executives can make money. Okay, so centralized systems are more profitable. On ramifications, they told, oh, but you can choose the best system for them. But the trouble with this is we've already explained to you why it's really clearly harmful at the point you've got any risk of collapse. And as such, we are able to explain to you why a system which keeps as many people out of that as possible is better. Further, they told you, oh, but you don't collapse the whole economy at once. We tell you, A, that whole economy doesn't actually collapse in a centralized system, but also, as Rhoda really clearly explained to you at third, what you really want to avoid is people losing all of their money at the point their bank accounts wiped out. That is really, really harmful, right? So at the end of this, it's unclear what advantage there is from having a decentralized system, other than maybe you can get marginally better interest rates, which we explained can already occur in the less risky form in a centralized system. So it's pretty clear that the economic benefits don't pan out. Finally, the logical extension of this, as we structurally prove to you down the line, is that you see things like cryptocurrency and other forms of risky fintech. These are uniquely hard to regulate. These are uniquely risky. They uniquely unlikely lead to people losing lots of money. In no world does a decentralized system provide more stability or economic opportunity.
I'd like to thank the affirmative reply for that speech and negative reply for that speech, and welcome affirmative reply to close the debate.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Wait, sorry. I'm gonna drink first. All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First clash, which is the biggest one, which one created a better economic system? Affirmative told you that interconnected actually creates vulnerability, therefore a decentralized system is more strategic because you spread out your resources and cash flow. Negative told us on the other hand that when you're connected, it's stronger because for the system to be destroyed, it takes more attempt. The tipping point for this engagement is first step of analysis because realize that we never say that economic downturns are created because of centralized system, but rather we tell you that when this external failure happen, a centralized system will be weaker. The reason is because first that we give you idea of liquidity of banks, which was never responded. By the way, we tell you that when all the cash flow always goes from central bank to these private banks or to this fintech, that's when um um that's when the economy is more vulnerable in that sense. We give you a case example. For example, during housing bubbles, when all banks are connected in that spider web, that's why it become weaker. So although it might be intuitive to think that when you band together you are stronger, but that's not applicable to financial system. Um, the tipping point for the second thing is, I guess, engaging to the new material that negative whip brought, which is that there are experts being able to maintain this actually still hasn't rebut us because our problem is not that the decision is inherently bad, but rather that the decision could be good, but the fact that it's all centralized is what makes it bad. That one blow to one bank will affect everything. And therefore, it's still not an exclusive case because financial experts of course exist on both sides of the house. Second clash then, this is about citizens trust, and this is the clash that essentially negative put their case on, right? Which is that they say banks will be irresponsible. For example, they do risky investment so that people lost interest in the financial system. Tipping point is first on charitability because first affirmative already told you that security regulations would still exist. Therefore, the burden for negative is to prove why the world will be that rogue, while a decentralized system would always mean an absolute freedom, in which, of course, it's likely countries or government always put some sort of regulations. So they're not very charitable. But second tipping point is on interest of banks. We do believe that we fulfill this more because we're the one that tell you, for example, they need competitive advantage. That's why some banks offer high interest on deposits, some perhaps not on deposits, but maybe on house mortgages. So there will be that kind of differences, right? It will not be all the same. But second interest is also talking about reputation, that you would want your people to put it. If it's too high, people will get suspicious. On the other hand, I don't think negative told us anything besides the fact that banks is inherently, have bad intentions, which is such a worst case scenario. And third tipping point is on exclusivity. I do think that yes, let's just say that some banks are bad. I think it can happen both on both sides of the house, right? They're probably anomaly. They just don't follow the rules. The delta is on yours in our side of the house. At least when central bank have to bail this bank out, it doesn't affect the whole economy. So if you want to talk about trust, we give you trust. Third clash, cryptocurrency. Negative told us that cryptocurrency is bad because it's unregulated, so people lose their money. Tipping point for this is first exclusivity, because do realize the problem that negative say is that lots of money are lost, right? But people can lose their money on stocks too, and stocks are regulated. Stocks are part of a centralized system. So if they don't agree with cryptocurrency, they are essentially against any kind of investment with any kind of risk, and that's not the burden of this debate, right? It's so weird that they're debating under the motion as if that we regret investment. Every affirmative way from our side has give you framing that crypto losing value is just a risk of any kind of investment. But second tipping point is also relevancy. We tell you that we don't live in a vacuum. Economy of the world isn't only cryptocurrency. What we posit is that more options. So even if that harm exists to some extent, it's mitigated. But second thing is because it's not relevant since cryptocurrency is that, and therefore when cryptocurrency crisis happen, it doesn't really affect bonds or stocks, right? Exactly, because it's centralized, and that proves exactly why the system is stronger to failure or for an external failure to propose.
All right. I would like to thank all teams for this debate. Invite both teams across the floor and shake hands. The panel will now deliberate for up to 15 minutes. So if you could please leave the room, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.